educational content. And for us that's very important, because otherwise the sharing of educational content, the sharing of open resources is going to bypass the educational systems of which we're all part. And they'll largely carry on operating as they have for the last 100 odd years or so. And what we think is dangerous about that is it means that there's going to be a significant tension between this open, sharing, knowledge-based network that's happening somewhat outside education, but which has tremendous value for education, and on the other hand, a system that is actually defending itself against that sharing of knowledge, instead of embracing it and harnessing it as a mechanism for improving the quality of education, the quality of collaboration, and the kinds of educational opportunities that we can construct for our learners. The simple reality, of course, is that good education, whether we're using open educational resources or proprietary content, simply cannot be created or sustained without spending properly on it. And we think something that's been lost in a lot of the policy debates in recent times, particularly in Africa, which is where we tend to be working, is that investment in education can only ever be justified in terms of the long-term social and economic benefits that it brings societies, not in terms of how it helps us to enroll more students at progressively declining unit costs. Now, for us, that's a very important issue, because what's a strong part of the discussion about sharing open educational content, particularly in developing country settings, is that many policymakers are seeing the notion of being able to harness open content as a way to drive costs down. In other words, their argument is that if we can download good quality material from the internet free of charge, then logically what we ought to be able to do is to reduce the running costs of education, because we no longer have to pay for the content. We think that if that's the direction in which open educational content moves, then its transformative potential in education will be lost. And really all we'll end up with is a lot of open educational resources being shared online, some of which are good, some of which are not, but not really any change in the practices that leads to systematic improvement through collaboration and through openness. So what we think the major challenge is to actually encourage people to see openness as a way of thinking about managing education systems, not simply as downloading free content from the internet and using it in your classroom, or for students to be able to use it to supplement maybe the lectures that they've been receiving from their academics. We think that deliberate openness acknowledges, as you see from my current slide, I hope, that investment in designing effective educational environments is critically important to good education. In other words, when we're operating in an open educational resource environment, it's fundamentally important that we invest money in designing and developing good quality curricula, good quality programs, good quality course materials on an ongoing basis. And we must be conscious about continuing to make that investment. The great benefit that open educational resources brings, of course, is that we are making that investment systematically, but then we're not having to rent from publishers or from people who control the intellectual capital. We're not having to rent that intellectual property every time we want to use it. And in any event, given the example of the music industry that I used in the beginning, those publishers who believe that their business models are going to continue to be based on rental of intellectual property to people who are in the education system, I think are going to find that increasingly they're going to struggle to survive as businesses. So they're going to have to change their business models so that increasingly they're offering the services of producing good quality materials on an ongoing basis, rather than just producing materials once and then trying to sell the copies of those materials as often as they possibly can. Linked to that, though, we think that a key to productive systems is to build on common intellectual capital rather than duplicating similar efforts. So just by way of example, in the South African schooling system, we have a number of publishers who sell textbooks into the system. Let's assume that all of those textbook publishers are commercially viable enterprises. Each of them has had to produce equivalent textbooks in all of the different subjects in which they want to compete. So, for example, there can be 15 to 20 versions of a mathematics grade 10 textbook available for purchase by schools and teachers. Each of them is having to make a venture capital investment in producing that material at their own cost. And then because they don't expect to be successful in selling all of their titles, they're spreading that cost of the venture capital investment across all of the titles that they are selling into the system. So what that means effectively is that the government and individual purchasers of textbooks are paying an enormous price of all of that venture capital investment, speculative investment really, in trying to create the best quality resources that then people will buy. And we don't think that there's any case to be made for that improving quality in the pre-market sense that people often talk about that happening. Because what we think it's doing is it's encouraging publishers to produce the material at the lowest possible cost that they can and still be competitive, and then focus on spreading their risk across a number of titles. On the other hand, if we shifted the point of competition to the point of production of materials, we could invest all of that venture capital in producing more and more diverse and different and interesting sets of resources that teachers could draw on and that they could be using in their classrooms without having to pay. And over time, as we built that common intellectual capital in an open environment, what we would end up with is a much richer, much more diverse base of available educational material for grade 10 mathematics than we're getting at the moment. Because at the moment, the method for competing, in other words, requiring publishers to invest first in producing the materials, and then hoping to sell some of them in order to recover their costs and make a profit, is actually creating textbooks that all look pretty much the same. Whereas if the government was retaining that and introducing competition at the point of production of the materials, they would have much more financial resource available to produce more interesting and different kinds of materials over time. And so we think that that's a very important way of thinking about creating productive education systems. Linked to that, of course, is the notion that, as far as we're concerned, all things being equal, collaboration will improve quality. My experience over and over again is that when, for example, an academic is producing his or her own course and writing the materials on her own in her office, the resulting materials are not of the same quality as they are when he or she is working in a team. If we can start to extend the scale of that team so that it draws in like-minded peers and networks of people from across institutions, the potential for improving quality is quite dramatic. But of course, as I note at the bottom, because education is always a contextualized practice, it's really important to make it easy to adapt materials imported from different settings where this is required. And we should be encouraging this rather than restricting it. So, for example, if here in South Africa we find a textbook or a resource or some educational content, a multimedia presentation that comes, say, from Ireland, we might see that that's a really very useful piece of content. But if we don't have the permission to adapt that content, there may be ways in which that content is just not relevant to the South African context that prevent us from using it. If, on the other hand, we had the ability to be able to adapt that content effectively, then we'd be able to introduce it into classrooms or higher education programs and contextualize it so that it was relevant to our students. Now, in OER Africa, we've been doing a lot of that kind of work. We've been taking, for example, nursing materials produced in America and working with, for example, the University of Malawi to contextualize and release that material, which is all open educational content, into nursing programs at the Kamuzu Colleges of Nursing in Malawi. And what it's enabled us to do at very low cost is to create highly contextualized, relevant materials, in this case for pre- and postnatal care, for a module in their nursing program, at very low cost. So we think that these are very exciting possibilities. So just coming towards the end of my presentation, and I hope, on the one hand, what I've just indicated is that the concept of openness at its core is really very simple. It's about making a decision that content that we produce, we're going to license in such a way that other people can use it. And increasingly, which I haven't mentioned